welcome, and let's take a look at a few other methods in Jest, and after that we'll start dealing with React and React testing library. So the one thing I'm gonna show you first is real quick, other than to be, you also have not, and you can chain this and it would give you to be. So you have basically a negation point and you can call anything you want after that. So it might be not to be called, whatever. So you might say not to be 1 plus 3, it should be 4, and you might write, well, not to be 2, while you really need it not to be 2. So if that's your test, I rarely find that actually useful, and I don't really use it, but I'm stuttering, so okay. So let's go into the next one, and the next one will be to equal, and that's what I want to show you. So let's suppose we have a function that says name me, that accepts a name parameter, and we return an object. I write it this way because it's ES6, and if property name matches with the variable name, instead of writing this, we can just write this, and that's ES6 for you. So we can write another test. So test should return an object with a name, with a past name. So let's say we have then const a result, and that we would call it name me, let's say John or whoever, and we would expect that result. The one thing you might think from previous example that it would be to be, and let's say, yeah, so that would be name, let's say John. Okay, but that would not actually work because to be uses a strict match, and if you ever have one object, let's say object 1, and you do this with object 2, that if they look identical to you, they're still not the same for JavaScript, so they would not, that would give you false always. But there is still a way to check this in Jest, and Jest is so cool that it will give you a message, an error message like this. So you see expected and received, and you might think, well, they look similar, they look no different at all. So that's what Jest tells you, that they have no visual difference, and that for deep equality only, in just this case scenario, use to equal instead. So whenever you test for object equality, you do to equal, and that would pass your test, and that you probably are going to use this a lot. And now all of our tests pass. Another thing I thought is interesting is to test for throwing errors. I don't know how useful that would be for you right now, but it is still, I think, kind of cool to know how to test for it, because sometimes, well, I've had to test for throwing errors a couple of times in the past month. So, okay, so function, let's say we have a function division A and B, and we return A over B. So how we would test for that? We would write a test, division test, and in this test, what we can do, write const result, division 10 over 5, and that would give us what? That would give us to be 2. So this test would pass, but there is one edge case scenario, like you cannot divide by 0, so how do you handle it? Well, the way you handle it depends on you, whether or what will you agree with other developers who use your code, how to deal with this kind of things. But let's just say that in this case, you would agree that you cannot pass a 0 at all, and you would always throw error when does that happen. And just in case, just for your information, if you do divide by 0 in JavaScript, it gives you special value infinity, which is not mathematically correct, but it is what it gives you in JavaScript. So let's say if b equals 0, then we would throw a new error and say, like, you cannot divide by 0. How do you test for this? So the way you test for this, you cannot, what you might think to do is, first of all, what kind of methods do you use on expect? You use to throw error. So that's first. You used to throw error. What do you pass here? Well, what you might, first inclination might be to do this, but that won't work, first of all, because it will call function with a 0, it will throw a new error, and it will fail our tests. So what you should do instead is you pass a reference to this function like this, because what I'm assuming Jest does, it puts it in a try catch block maybe. I don't really know. I don't know how Jest works under the hood. But when you just pass the reference, it won't have a 0 argument to it. So how do we do it? How do we pass a function with parameters 10 and 0? We use a bind method. Hopefully you know it, and if you don't, well, we actually have this. For a given function, it creates a bound function that has the same body as the original function. Okay, so what does this mean? First, we pass a context, which in this case will be null, and then we pass a list of arguments. So let's say 10 and 0, and it could be how many you want. But what is null here is that we don't need any context in this function. But if we use anywhere in this function a keyword this, then we would need to pass a context, because the way JavaScript works is this might change depending on where you did call your function. So let's not go into that right now. The only thing that's important here is that you pass a reference to expect a reference to a function with these parameters, and you would expect to have thrown an error, and that actually works. So division test works. You can also check for what the error did throw. In this case, we have you cannot divide by 0, but that's not a strict check. They look for I'm not really I cannot tell you like the detail how they look for it, but I can tell you, like, if you write this as substring, it partially matches and it will pass, even though that's not completely the same string. But if you pass some gibberish that's not found in this string, it won't pass and it will give you an error. So, okay. Other than that, we have this. Let's also say another example test. We have methods on expect to be truthy and to be falsy. So first of all, how do you test? How do you differ? What's truthy? What's falsy? The way you do it, whatever you pass in this Boolean type, whatever value is in this Boolean that would give you false, that's a falsy, and whatever gives you true, that's a truthy. But not to do that every time, you need to make sure what's truthy, what's falsy. You can just remember that there are actually 6 things in JavaScript that are falsy, and everything else will be truthy. Even though maybe you would think that the way it works it's otherwise, that there are some times that are truthy and everything else is falsy, but actually no. 6 values that are falsy, everything else is truthy, and those values are false, of course: 0, empty string, not a number, undefined, null, and I think that's 6 of them. Yeah, that's 6. So how does this work? So let's say we have, well, let's use the sum function. If we use sum and pass it 0 and 0, so what would that be? That should be to be falsy, actually. Oh, to be falsy. So let's say if our test pass in this case, and yes, they do pass because 0 is a falsy value. But if it would be any other number, sum 1 and 2, that would be to be truthy. So that's the other 2 methods. So we covered to be falsy, to be truthy, we covered how to check for throwing errors, we covered to equal, and we covered to be, and we covered a negation here. You can look for other stuff in here, like there is stuff to be greater than or to be less than. The way it would work, you would say expect result to be greater than, let's say, 1. It reads better English, but what would I find myself doing in most cases, that I would do something like this, and I would just say to be true. Whatever works for you, whatever you think is better. Whatever you think is better, do that. Well, that would be it for today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.